But why theology?
Essentially what happened was it came time to write my final exam in chemistry, and I got given this booklet. It really hit me. I have no idea what I'm doing.
Okay, yeah.
And I ended up getting something like 4% on the final exam, and so that was a sign. Maybe I shouldn't be in chemistry. I didn't think I could convince my parents to make my major theology,
right?
But I think I thought that I could convince my parents to make my major in English.
Yeah.
English was sort of my workaround to be able to do theology in English. And my campus minister says, "Hey, would you be interested in coming to a listening session? Archbishop Richard Smith is coming." And I said, "The Archbishop? What's he want to do with kings?" And I said, "I'm there." Yeah.
And that's where I was taught by you or by one of the others that you're being taught today that you have to create your own self, right? And it's leaving people so terrified and everything. And I had a chance to be part of a bishop's panel discussion with about, it was a few hundred anyway, young adults your age, your generation, in Calgary a couple of weeks ago. And so I was telling this to them, and everybody was just kind of nodding their heads, because it's how all of that is giving rise in people's hearts and minds right now to a deep, deep anxiety.
With the Catholic Church, I think one of the things that I think I'm compelled by is this idea that there's a welcoming there, and we welcome you into a narrative that's being written, right? And you don't necessarily get to write your own narrative, and there's something deeply liberating about that. I give the analogy.
That's really good.
And I think I give the analogy of, you watch, say, a Gap ad, for example, right? Like Gap, the clothing.
Oh, yeah. You got to explain these things to this old guy,
yeah,
right?
yeah. But Gap, you're probably familiar.
Gap.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, GAP, people walking around in their new apparel. And at the very end of the ad, it gets real interesting because they have this line and it says, "Be yourself." What does that mean to be ourselves? And I think that looks really different for a Christian. But I think what Gap's trying to get at is this idea that you can invent yourself, you can be yourself, and one of the ways you could be yourself is buying our product.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, I was just mentioning this to someone, that kind of reduces us to this idea that to be is to buy.
It's ironic, too, because be yourself by buying our products that many, many others are buying. So be yourself, by looking like everybody else, acting like everybody else. So it's there's an internal contradiction.
I think one of the things that I find compelling about the Catholic Church and, say, its liturgy, for example, is that, I think we have this idea that the Catholic Church is liturgical, and as an evangelical, we're not liturgical. Or even if I'm not a Catholic or an evangelical, this idea that I exist outside of liturgy. You can't avoid liturgy. There's this liturgy of consumerism, and it comes through the form of advertising. We might not go to church, but we end up going to the church called the mall,
or the church called the hockey arena.
And then we sing the national hymn.
That's it. But those are some of the things I think we can talk about a little bit further when we show you the basilica, right? Because I'm becoming more and more convinced that the answer to the individualism, the relativism, and all the anxiety that goes with it is precisely what you just identified: liturgy. I think we have to understand what liturgy is, who the principal actor is in liturgy, what its effects are, how it's celebrated, how it's expressed in symbol, before we can really appreciate why it is the answer to all of these things.
So we make it more than purely ritual, because I think that's perhaps maybe the biggest critique that perhaps an evangelical like myself would have is, do Catholics even understand the rituals that they're a part of? And I think from sort of doing my own kind of reading, when someone explains to me those rituals, explains to me sort of the crossing oneself, explains to me sort of why you gesticulate, right? Or genuflect. Yeah, that's right.
We do the other two.
Yeah. And hopefully, yes. I think to myself, wow, is that not profound?
Yeah.
We need to cherish this liturgy, and we simultaneously need to be in the process of explaining it.
Well, what I'm finding very fascinating too, and maybe it's one of the reasons I'm making this link between liturgy and this existential angst that exists among so many young adults today, is the fact that many in your generation now are finding themselves drawn to the traditional expression of Roman Catholic liturgy. In fact, when I was on that panel of bishops with the young people, one of the questions that they posed to me was, why do I think young people are drawn to the more traditional expressions of Roman Catholic liturgy and so on? And we've made a concerted effort here at St. Joseph's Basilica at the Sunday High Mass to introduce Gregorian chant, polyphonic singing, all those things that really are expressive, deeply expressive, and in a way that's recognized by everybody as rooted in the Catholic identity, Catholic tradition. So we're doing all of that, and I was talking to some of the parishioners not long ago. They're noticing the number of young adults that are starting to show up and being drawn to this.
You know, Bishop Barron, you're probably familiar with Bishop Barron, but wow, he is just a force online.
God's hand is on him in a wonderful way.
And I think, we could use more of him.
Absolutely.
I was reading an article, I think that he directed me to, and he said that some of the Eastern bishops in Eastern Europe had talked to their youth and asked them, what do you cherish about the Catholic Church? What do you think needs to be supported and encouraged and fostered? And it was almost unanimous. These young parishioners were saying, we want Eucharist. We want liturgy.
Well, yeah.